It was a quiet Tuesday morning when I stopped by the neighborhood grocery store on my way home from dropping my kids off at school, and the place had that slow mid-morning calm where only a handful of shoppers wandered the aisles. Under the steady hum of fluorescent lights, carts squeaking occasionally across the polished tile floors, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery section, and soft instrumental music playing over the speakers, while I pushed my cart toward the cereal aisle with a short list in my hand that my wife had texted me earlier, expecting the trip to be one of those simple 10-minute errands that you barely think about afterward, because nothing about that quiet store suggested that within the next 20 minutes, the police officers would be standing in the cereal aisle responding to a 911 call made. Because I answered my phone, I had just stopped halfway down the aisle comparing the brands of cereal when my phone rang in my pocket. And when I pulled it out and saw my sister's name on the screen, I answered right away, because she rarely called during the day unless something important was happening with our mom, who had been dealing with a few health issues recently. So I tucked the phone between my ear and shoulder while scanning the shelf and said, "Hey, what's going on?" in a normal conversational tone, not loud at all, just the kind of voice anyone uses when they're talking on the phone in a public place where people are nearby, but the space isn't crowded. My sister sounded slightly stressed on the other end as she explained that our mom's doctor's office had just called her and moved an appointment forward to the next morning instead of later in the week. And since she had meetings all day, she wanted to know if I could take mom to the appointment, which was the kind of family favor that never even required a second thought. So while I casually pushed my cart a few feet forward and grabbed the cereal my wife liked, I told her, "Yeah, that's fine. I can pick mom up around 8 and take her." While we briefly discussed the clinic location and paperwork, the whole conversation lasting maybe a minute. At some point during that short call, I noticed a woman standing farther down the aisle, looking in my direction. But at first, I didn't pay attention because grocery stores are full of people, glancing around at shelves and other shoppers all the time. Yet when I finished the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket, I realized she was still staring directly at me with a look that wasn't casual curiosity, but something closer to irritation. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she stood beside her cart with 2 boxes of oatmeal in her hands, like she had been frozen in the middle of choosing between them. She was probably in her late 50s or early 60s with neatly styled blonde hair and sunglasses perched on top of her head like a headband, dressed in a bright patterned blouse and white pants that looked carefully pressed, the type of shopper who carried herself with the air of someone who expected the world around her to follow a certain set of personal rules. And the moment our eyes met, she stepped closer and said sharply, "Excuse me," in a tone that immediately suggested she wasn't about to ask where the sugar aisle was. I turned my cart slightly toward her and said politely, "Yes," assuming she might want help reaching something or ask a simple question. But instead she frowned and said, "You can't do that here," which confused me enough that I asked, "Can't do what?" Because nothing about grabbing cereal or ending a phone call seemed remotely controversial. Yet she answered as if the issue should have been obvious to anyone with basic manners, saying, "You can't take phone calls in the aisle like that. People are trying to shop and you're disrupting everyone." For a moment, I honestly thought she was joking or exaggerating, because the aisle was nearly empty except for the 2 of us, and my conversation had been quiet enough that I doubted anyone 10 feet away would have noticed. So I gave a small apologetic shrug and said, "Sorry if it bothered you. It was just a quick call from my sister," assuming that would end the interaction the way most minor misunderstandings do. But instead her expression hardened and she replied, "That's not the point. It's rude and inconsiderate." I glanced around the aisle again, partly out of disbelief and partly to confirm that there wasn't a hidden crowd of shoppers glaring at me for ruining their morning cereal selection with my outrageous phone behavior. But there was no one else there, so I calmly said, "I wasn't trying to be rude. I just answered a call, then reached for the cart handle and started to continue my shopping, figuring the easiest way to end the conversation was simply to move on and let her return to comparing oatmeal flavors. However, the moment I took 2 steps past her, she raised her voice and said, "Don't walk away when I'm talking to you," which stopped me long enough to turn back in mild disbelief, because being scolded by a stranger in a grocery store over a 30-second phone call felt surreal enough that part of me wondered if this was some kind of prank or misunderstanding. Yet when I faced her again, she was glaring at me with the determined expression of someone who had decided a serious rule had been broken. I tried once more to defuse the situation by saying calmly, "Look, I already apologized and I'm just trying to finish my shopping." But instead of letting it go, she pulled her phone out of her purse and began dialing while staring directly at me, which at first made me assume she was calling a friend to complain about the rude guy in the cereal aisle. Yet the moment she said, "Yes, I'd like to report a disturbance at Green Valley Market," I realized she was speaking to emergency services. For a second, I thought she must be exaggerating the situation out of frustration. So I said carefully, "Ma'am, you're not seriously calling the police because I answered my phone." But she ignored me completely and continued speaking to the dispatcher with an air of dramatic urgency, saying, "There's a man here causing a disturbance and harassing customers," which made me laugh in disbelief, even though the absurdity of the moment was starting to attract attention from the end of the aisle. A young store employee wearing a green apron walked over after hearing the raised voices and asked cautiously if everything was all right. But before I could explain anything, the woman pointed at me and announced, "No, everything is not all right. This man has been yelling into his phone and disturbing everyone," which made the employee look confused enough that he glanced at me as if trying to figure out whether he had walked into the middle of some argument. That started long before he arrived. I explained simply I answered a call from my sister for about 30 seconds, while the woman continued describing the situation into her phone, as though she were reporting a major public disruption. And after a moment, the employee said he would get the manager, which seemed like a reasonable step, even though I suspected the whole thing would end once someone in charge explained that answering a phone in a grocery store wasn't exactly a criminal offense. The manager, a middle-aged guy named Tom, who I recognized from shopping there regularly, arrived a minute later and listened patiently while the woman launched into an animated explanation about how I had been loudly shouting into my phone and refusing to stop when confronted. But when Tom looked at me and asked what happened, I simply said, "I took a phone call," which earned a quiet sigh from him that suggested he already suspected this situation was going to be unnecessarily complicated. Tom tried to gently explain that customers often take quick phone calls while shopping, and that it usually isn't a problem. But by that point, the woman had already told the dispatcher she would wait in the aisle for the police to arrive, which made Tom rub the back of his neck with the expression of someone realizing this peaceful Tuesday morning had suddenly turned into an official incident. And sure enough, about 6 minutes later, 2 uniformed officers walked into the store and headed toward the cereal aisle. By then, a few curious shoppers had gathered at the end of the aisle, pretending to browse nearby shelves while quietly watching the scene unfold. And when the officers approached, the woman immediately pointed at me and declared, "That's him," prompting one officer to calmly ask what the issue was, while I stood there beside my cart, wondering how answering a routine phone call about my mother's doctor appointment had somehow escalated into a police response. In the cereal section, the officers listened politely as she described my disruptive behavior. But when they asked me for my side of the story, and I simply explained that I had taken a brief phone call from my sister, both officers exchanged a quick glance that looked suspiciously like they were trying not to laugh. And one of them finally said gently to the woman, "Mom, calling 911 because someone answered their phone in a grocery store isn't considered an emergency." Her face turned red as she insisted that I had been rude and disruptive. Yet the officer calmly explained that emergency services were meant for serious situations, and that disagreements between shoppers didn't qualify. While Tom, the manager, nodded quietly beside us, and the small group of onlookers pretended to study cereal boxes while clearly enjoying the unexpected drama of the morning, which ended with the officers politely advising her not to call 911 for non-emergencies again. After that, the tension dissolved quickly as the woman grabbed her cart and hurried away down the aisle, muttering about poor customer service. The officers told me I was free to continue shopping, and Tom apologized for the strange situation before returning to the front of the store, leaving me standing there in the cereal aisle shaking my head and laughing quietly to myself about the fact that a simple phone call about driving my mom to a doctor appointment has somehow resulted into police officers responding to a disturbance. In the breakfast food section,